Alrighty. Welcome back, everyone. This is episode 2 of my new Policy Lab series. Just to go over some quick reminders, my name is Robert Bennett. I'm running for Congress in North Carolina's 2nd Congressional District. That is the area that basically encompasses Raleigh, most of Cary, parts of Garner, Knightdale, and Zebulon. I've lived here for 10 years, and I want to use this Policy Lab series as a chance to talk about some of my key policy proposals and really walk through them in depth, one by one. And in the first episode, I talked about proportional representation and its really profound impacts for not just our democracy, but really for stopping the issue of gerrymandering in the United States. Specifically, if we allow proportional representation or multi-member districts, if you will, for US Congress, especially, that can allow more independent candidates and even smaller party candidates to get a foothold and, frankly, break the partisan stalemate. Proportional representation is basically multi-member districts, so it doesn't really make gerrymandering as big of a deal. And one of the keys to making proportional representation work is increasing the number of U.S. House districts across the board in the country so that regardless of how the maps are drawn, that you have more people to represent you, regardless of what your party affiliation is. That was in the first video. This is obviously part 2 of proportional representation, where I want to talk about this idea I have for a proportional representation memorandum of understanding. This is something I've been working on for several months leading up to this race. It is something I've written about on my Substack channel. You can go read more about it there. I will put a link to that in the description below. I'll put other resources in the description as well. Of course, I'm running for Congress, so if you're interested in donating to the campaign, you can go to robertfrenzy.com. And I also need to mention, as I talk about proportional representation, that in North Carolina, unaffiliated voters and Democratic Party voters both can vote for me. I am a Democrat. That is my identity. I'm not running away from it. Um, but you're going to understand, frankly, why I mentioned that in almost every other video. The fact that unaffiliated Democrats both can vote for me, as I explain what this MOU is. So, without further ado, let's dive in. And we'll start by just giving some brief context as to what the problem here really is gerrymandering, right? And the honest truth that most Democratic Party leaders in the state will not talk about is it's being done by both major parties. Those major parties, of course, being the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Both the Democrats with Gavin Newsom are doing it in California. Republicans obviously are doing it in Texas and much recently in North Carolina, where they're basically trying to draw Don Davis out of his seat in, I believe his district is North Carolina District 5. And what's worse is that other states reportedly are interested in following suit. There have been a lot of headlines about New York and Illinois, both redrawing their maps in favor of Democrats. Those are obviously two Democrat-leaning states. And part of the backdrop of all this gerrymandering is the 2026 midterms, where it is well known that with each midterm, the opposite party tends to gain more seats in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate, uh, just kind of as a symptom of pushback to the current president. Uh, I'm not here to speculate as to what happens in 2026. That's not the point, but that is one of the reasons why you are seeing this gerrymandering across the country. Meanwhile, though, there are some really important facts that need to be said that the Democratic Party leaders in North Carolina are not telling you. And even though the approval rate, or excuse me, The approval rating for Democrats is at an abysmal 30-year low, even as Donald Trump is in his second term. So, despite all the headlines about Trump attacking our democracy, the gerrymandering, ICE, the canceled government grants, all that stuff, the approval rating for Democrats is still abysmal. Only 8% of registered voters, according to a Gallup poll, said they view the Democratic Party favorably, and 63%, so the vast majority of the respondents in this survey from Gallup, said it is out of touch with everyday concerns of Americans. And I take that a bit personal, not just because I am a Democrat, but I am not one of the establishment Democratic Party leaders. All right. So I really I don't even want to get into it. But anyway, the approval rating for Democrats is low. In North Carolina, my state I've lived in for 10 years now, and been a Democrat in for 10 years, registered unaffiliateds now outnumber both Democrats and Republicans in terms of how many unaffiliateds there are versus the other two. The number of independents, I use independents and unaffiliated voters simultaneously, or synonymously, excuse me. Number of independents in North Carolina has continued to grow. Frankly, it'll continue to grow. From September 2020, as of September 2025, Wake County has 374,000 unaffiliated voters and about 270 odd thousand Democratic Party voters. What's important to note about that stat is the number of registered unaffiliated voters in Wake County, my entire district, North Carolina District 2, a congressional district, is in Wake County. And that number has increased by 11,000 votes for unaffiliated, or registered voters for unaffiliated from May to September of this year. Again, all the while Trump is on the loose doing what he's doing in the White House. The number of unaffiliated in his state has only gone up. And the conclusion is, frankly, very simple. In short, the Democratic Party strategy is not winning over more voters in the state of North Carolina. And quite frankly, I think it's pretty obvious that the same can be said about other states throughout the country. And I know that's a bit of a tough pill to swallow for some of my fellow Democrats that might be listening to this, but as a hopeful member of Congress, I need to speak the truth, even to my own tribe. Part two. In 30 states where voter registration data is published publicly, this same stat holds true. The share of registered voters who are either unaffiliated with either major party or they're just third party has increased by nearly 9% since 2000. Nationally, independents and third parties now outnumber Republicans at about 32% of registered voters nationwide, compared to Republicans is that compared to 31% for the Republican Party. Donald Trump in 2024 only won votes from about 22% of the US population, roughly 77 million people. And that is a far cry from a majority. And in short, the way I interpret that is Donald Trump is an insurgent of American politics. He always has been. He frankly always will be. He is purposely trying to disrupt our democracy, disrupt all of our government institutions and systems. But the thing that has allowed him to be successful is that we do not empower voters across the country. And that is why his insurgency on American politics sadly has worked. And here's something that needs to be said is democracy needs to be about building coalitions. Most democracies around the world, not just in Europe, but in other places, do not actually have a two-party system or a two-party equivalent. And I know some Democrats are going to disagree with me on this, but I don't care. We need to abandon the two-party system and instead focus on building a coalition, namely in this case, as I will explain under this MOU agreement, around proportional representation. So again, my thesis on why Democrats should support this new coalition, it is basically a coalition between Democrats, independent voters, and even potentially smaller political parties that can collaborate on a nonviolent, I will repeat, nonviolent counterinsurgency effort to counter Donald Trump, focus on things like community aid, to really build relationships with voters, and particularly to identify candidates that, as I call MOU candidates, to support proportional representation. And again, proportional representation essentially leads to coalition building. You know, not everyone in politics needs to be best friends, but the way you get things done well in politics oftentimes is by working with the other side. And we kind of have this taboo in America of, what we call being bipartisan. Under proportional representation, it wouldn't be bipartisan because there'd be more than two parties, but we need to build coalitions, including sometimes with people on the other side, because it shouldn't be taboo. It should be viewed as a sign of a functioning democracy. And indeed, if you look at what Congress used to do, especially in the last century, they actually had, in that case, more bipartisanship. In other words, closer to what would be a coalition like this. And we have long since abandoned that. So, again, the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding. If you're not familiar with that term, MOUs are a very common practice in public policy and business especially. It is, for in simplest way possible, a written agreement signed by the people involved saying we will accomplish this together. That is what an MOU is. So, MOU candidates, as I like to call them in this case, are independent, Democratic Party, or third party candidates that really can be at all three levels of government. But in this case, I'm going to really put the emphasis mostly on Congress. This approach can work for state legislatures. We won't talk about that here, but it is worth mentioning that it could absolutely be applied to a state legislature. The key, though, is that these candidates sign an MOU to support legislation for proportional representation and increase the number of representatives within the U.S. House and stop the two-party system just in its tracks. Now, I know there's going to be some skeptics watching this video, and so just to address them head on, I want to mention that this is not meant to be a cure-all solution for American democracy or things like that, but it does do a good job of, you know, bringing back working with the other side, reducing a lot of the political polarization and tension and that sort of thing. And quite frankly, it gives us a chance to increase representation across the United States, which really should be the goal, in my opinion, is addressing the issue that so many people just do not feel like they have a voice in politics. And that's true of many people who are on the left, right, and center both. And regardless of where you lean politically, I think everyone should have a chance to find a representative for them. That is how we de-escalate tensions, not escalate tensions, which is what the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in not just this state, other states around the country have been doing these last few months. Escalation is not good, guys. That is why we need this MOU. We need candidates to help break the two-party system down. I am saying that as a Democrat for Congress because it needs to be said. All right, that was intense. But look, there are four keys to really making this MOU strategy work. And again, I've written about this on Substack. I will leave that link below, but it is worth revisiting those here just so we can walk through them a little bit. Again, like I mentioned, a formal MOU between Democrats, third parties, smaller parties, if you will, and independent voters. I know that if you're an independent voter, you technically don't have a party, obviously. So it could be everyday people that sign this MOU. It could even be, nonpartisan NGOs or community groups that, sign it as representatives of unaffiliated voters, if you will. But the goal is to have understanding that they will collaborate to pass proportional representation legislation in Congress. Now, we don't need to worry right now about whether it's in 2026 or 2028 because the goal is we need to start working on this MOU and this new coalition right now because no one's currently doing it. Um, Again, as an important key, make sure you also start a discussion about adding more seats to the US House. The more representatives in the House we have, the more constituent services that can work for, you know, people that need a voice in politics, which is really important. Um, but also just to make sure that proportional representation works correctly by giving more representatives to everybody. The third key to this, and this is really about building the coalition over time, is a community and mutual aid partnership between these groups to build trust with voters and improve the community. I think it's fair to say that politics has been focused too much on things like attack ads, tweets, and things like that, whereas they've kind of lost touch with the community, right? Well, let's fix that by focusing on community aid projects. It could be a canned food drive. It could be donating school supplies. There's more than enough ideas to go around. But the point is, make this community and mutual aid partnership to help find candidates that would support proportional representation. They could be independent candidates or smaller party candidates, and more importantly, build trust with voters. And yeah, that the third and fourth key are very closely tied here. As you build that partnership, you again get a chance to find candidates in the US House and even potentially US Senate to help pass proportional representation. You only need a simple majority in both chambers of Congress to get this done. So it is not as massive of a haul as you may think. Again, I touched on this a little bit a moment ago, but this coalition that I'm talking about, this MOU, you can start building it right now. There's nothing stopping political parties from working together from a legal point of view. They just choose not to. Now, in the current landscape of American politics, we have been just trained to hate the other side. So if I'm a Democrat, I hate Republicans. If I'm a Republican, I'm trained to hate Democrats. But that's not how this should work, okay? I don't hate Republicans. I vehemently disagree with a lot of Republican policies. I do not like a lot of the people that are in power in the Republican Party, namely Donald Trump. But it doesn't matter how strong my feelings are. The truth is that you build a good democracy by building coalitions, which is something that we are not doing right now. So, with independents, smaller parties, Democrats, both, we can start building this coalition right now. I also developed a formula to help show how different congressional races can help support what I like to call MOU candidates. So these are candidates for Congress that support proportional representation, and we don't need to win every single race across the country. Like I said, we just need a simple majority in Congress to pass legislation, um, and then we're off to the races. So let me carefully walk through the formula. Um, I did a couple things. I developed this formula myself. I also tested it on different US Congress races, about three or four of them here in North Carolina, including some that are currently held by Republicans. I tested it on, the Senate race in Alaska, a race or two in Florida, and one other one in Arizona. And this formula is kind of based off not just what I developed, but putting it to the test against actual, congressional districts. So what the formula is basically to find U.S. Congress districts. I should have written that down here. Where the registered voters by party ID are roughly 30% Democratic Party, anywhere between 3 to 10% for smaller parties. Every state really varies widely on that. And roughly 32% of independent voters as a percentage of the registered voters, and roughly 30% Republican Party. If those proportions are true for a district, then a coalition can work together to achieve the following turnout numbers on election day in support of a candidate that wants proportional representation. So if these, excuse me, if these MOU candidates can get 85% turnout from Democrats in support of an MOU candidate, 3 to 10% turnout from smaller parties for a MOU candidate, 35% turnout roughly from independents for an MOU candidate, and if the Republican Party only gets about 90% turnout for their own party candidate, then this formula works. I tested this formula in North Carolina House districts and a few other races across the country. It basically works to flip Republican controlled seats, even many of them that cross some of the more rural or to an extent gerrymandered lines. And again, the turnout number for independents in this case is relatively low. Expecting only 35% of independents to vote for an MOU candidate might actually be low in this case. So I tested what if you get that turnout number to be closer to 50% for an MOU candidate, and even more districts have the potential to be flipped. Arizona District 5 is one such example. Where originally this formula did not work, but when I bumped up the number of independents to about 50%, then you really have a chance to flip that district. So formula is pretty powerful. Again, it will not work on every US House race. That is okay, but it can work to help build a coalition that then could support proportional representation. That is the goal of this formula. And again, the goal is not to be best friends, just to support proportional representation. A couple other keys to making this work is to keep voter registration data public. It is currently public in about 30 states. Oftentimes, you have to find them on the state Board of Elections dashboard for each state, but as long as that's made public, we can figure out where these districts are. So that's very important. And the coalition needs to work closely with state attorney generals, state election boards, legal counsel, and of course, voters to prevent any sort of issues with voter registration, voter purges, and things like that. Because I think we could all probably guess once a strategy like this is put into motion, a lot of Republicans are not going to like it, and they may even try to sabotage it. So, making sure that the right people are ready for that is very important. And kind of like I mentioned earlier, it probably won't work in every district. I tested this formula that I went over a moment ago in Florida District 19, and there simply were just too many Republican votes to go around. And quite simply, my advice is to avoid races that are too gerrymandered or frankly just too much in favor of an incumbent Republican, whichever one is true there. And remember, guys, a lot of party leaders are just not going to like this idea, and I understand why. I just think at the same time that America is in such a rough spot with its democracy, and it's abundantly clear that the two-party system is not working, especially in North Carolina, that it is now or never to get this country into a better place. I think proportional representation and other changes to our democracy at the federal level are what is needed to get us get us as a nation into a better place. And as much as some party leaders are not going to like what I'm saying, I do think it is the truth, and I think the public needs to hear it. So, thank you so much for watching this video. I know this is a very touchy subject, not just for me, but for a lot of people, both in a Democratic Party and unaffiliated voters alike. I hope that, or I should say, my goal is that proportional representation inspires you to think that there's a light at the end of the tunnel with all of this, that we can actually get American democracy to a better place if we build this coalition around MOU candidates. I know it's not going to be easy, but good things don't happen by lazy work. Good things happen with hard work. And we need to put in the hard work to make this a reality. Um, that is a goal of my campaign in District 2, is to do things like community aid projects and push for proportional representation in Congress. It is one of the biggest priorities for me. You can learn more about my campaign at robertfornc.com. Stay tuned for more Policy Lab videos. I think the next one is going to be on transportation because I know there's been a lot of headlines in this area about it with the state fair going on and just traffic. I don't like traffic. But stay tuned for that. I've got plenty of more videos coming your way. As always, like, rate, subscribe. Consider donating to my campaign. Donations are what keep this campaign alive, so your support is appreciated. Thank you so much.